Well, thanks everyone for coming this afternoon, and apologies for, I think we delayed it by a week or two, so I hope that didn't muck everyone's schedules up too much with delaying the presentation. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional owners' land of the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also extend my respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who work at the UCRH and also who are here today. I'm Jodie. I'm a researcher here at the UCRH, and we hold these seminars on a monthly basis. The seminars are a collaboration with the Centre for Rural Health, the PHN, Southern Cross University, and also the LHD. So keep an eye out for the presentations that we do have on a monthly basis, and we do have quite a diverse range of topics. Thanks to Alex also for pulling together, and Holly, the seminar today. So thank you for all your work with that. So we've got tea and coffee out in the foyer there, so feel free to stay and have some tea and coffee. The bathrooms are just, if you head out this door to your right and then to your right again. The seminar is being video and audio recorded, so if you want more, we can arrange that for you. Please make sure you turn off your phones, and also we will ensure that we've got question time at the end, because I think that's where a lot of the rich conversation occurs. Before we move on to today's presentation, our next seminar is on the 15th of August, and we have Paul Orick presenting on osteopathic healthcare. So 15th of August. So without further, quite a lot that you have to get through. So today, Veronica Matthews will be presenting on the role of resilience in community wellbeing after the flood. The Community Recovery After Flood project has been designed, conducted and supported by a team of researchers, and also importantly community advisory groups that are based in Lismore and Mooloolaba. So it's a real community academic partnership. The project's being managed by Dr. Matthews with support from Joe, Maddie, and also overall leadership from Ross. So if you could welcome Veronica. Thank you.
Thanks, Jodie. Just bear with me for a minute while I bring up the slides. Okay, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which we've gathered on today, the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Veronica. I also work here within the UCRH as a researcher. Originally, I come from Queensland, from Quandamooka country on Minjerribah, which is North Stradbroke Island, for those of you who know that beautiful part of the world. And I'm lucky enough to live and work here on Bundjalung country, and also to be part of this research team, which are fantastic and very supportive. So I'm presenting on their behalf on the role of resilience in community wellbeing after the 2017 flood. So yeah, as Jodie mentioned, sorry for the false start about a month ago. I had to be elsewhere. Yeah, up in Northern Peninsula area, sort of helping out with a strep A outbreak, which was an experience in itself, but that's a story for another time. But I'm here today to hopefully address some of these questions. We're going to look at what the level of resilience was based on survey respondent feedback 6 months after the flood. What are the key components of that social capital concept that were key to reducing adverse psychological outcomes? And are there differences amongst respondent groups? And we've got a particular interest here in marginalised subpopulations. And then from that, what are some of the key strengths that we might build upon to improve resilience. So just taking a few steps back, I don't really need to tell you about this. Everyone knows that Debbie was different. It was one of the most destructive storm systems within the country. You know, it went through Queensland, it crossed the border to us, then it tracked over to New Zealand and caused a fair amount of damage over there. The key point here is that with climate change projections, there are predictions of this more high intensity flooding on the east coast of Australia. So following Debbie and with community, we felt that there are some lessons we can learn from that event to help us prepare for the future. Also to inform existing knowledge gaps. We know that psychological impacts are long lasting. And we know that social capital and resilience can buffer those psychological impacts. But how does that play out for our community? And what can be done for us in terms of mitigating that future impact? As Jodie mentioned, this is really truly a community academic partnership. We formed the first community advisory groups within 3 months of Debbie. And this is just an indication of the organisations, community, government and business that make up those advisory groups. And we really cannot thank them enough for the support that they have given us. They're instrumental in designing the project as well as the survey and getting the survey out there and helping us with respondent rates. So what also fed into the survey design, we did have was this conceptual framework on flood impact on health and wellbeing, which was designed with the help of mental health expertise, both within the UCRH, but also external to the UCRH. And this framework basically represents the relationship of what happened during the flood. So on your left, the impact of flooding on psychological health and wellbeing of community. And along that pathway, we've got different factors which may work to exacerbate those impacts, or they may work to alleviate those impacts. And they're things like pre-flood mitigation systems, like how well the community is well planned for such an event, the infrastructure system, warning systems, what was the immediate service response like, and also perceptions of those responses from community. And the thing that we're looking at today is that first green square there around community, personal factors and individual resilience. So how well a person is connected into community. So the important thing about that particular box is that there are some factors there that are more amenable to change than others. So this is the interest with these resilience factors, is that we can work out potentially what we can do to build resilience as an adaptive strategy. So I'll quickly go through this because it's probably old news for most of you. The survey that we sent out 6 months after, we were targeting everybody within the Northern Rivers region, from the Tweed down to Richmond Valley and out to Kyogle, everyone over 16 years. When I say everyone, I mean everybody that even those people that may not have been directly impacted by the flood. The survey was available as an online survey or a paper-based survey. And we were interested in canvassing different sections of the community in terms of how they experienced the flood. So from previous research, we know that these particular groups are more vulnerable to natural disasters. So that includes people living with a disadvantage. And we've used a proxy measure for that, which is people on income support, farmers, business owners, the old and the young, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and the LGBTIQ community. I mentioned from the framework that the survey also includes exposure variables. So that includes how many sites were damaged. It could have been none. Maybe the suburb, a person's suburb was affected, their yard, maybe their home was inundated, or home of a loved one. It also included measures around evacuation and displacement. And for outcomes, we used validated screening tools to measure post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression. The post-traumatic stress measure was directly linked to the event because we prefaced the standard screening tool questions with thinking about severe flood and rain. Have you experienced these issues over a 4-week period? It also included the mediators, which we've just discussed around warning systems, what was available post-disaster, and existing social capital. So the focus of the talk are the bolded bits, by the way. So who responded? Thank you to the community. We had more than 2,500 people that provided their stories. Over 60% were women, so it's an overrepresentation of females compared to males. In terms of our target group, we got 8% farmers, 30% were business owners. The majority were from the Lismore local government area, about a quarter were from the Tweed. We got 3.3% Aboriginal respondents and 5.5% LGBTIQ respondents. In terms of what was flooded, almost all reported some damage. However, there was an important group that reported no sites damaged, and that's at 9%, which forms an important comparator group. Almost 1/2 of the respondents reported some damage in 3 or more sites, so that cumulative impact has an effect as well. How respondents were affected, 1 in 7 people reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and depression. So there is a great deal of distress 6 months after the flood. So in terms of how the flood impacted on mental health, this slide just really provides a bit of a summary about the sort of damage that did affect people particularly in terms of their mental health risk. So compared to no damage, people whose properties were flooded, and that could be their business or farm or their home, had elevated risks related to each of those health outcomes. And also those who endured lengthy displacement. So they were out of their homes for more than 6 months. And we know from the literature that marginalised populations generally are more impacted and affected by natural disasters, and this was the case within our region. So what this table shows with the dots is that for those subpopulation, the people living with disadvantage, the income support recipients, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander respondents, as well as LGBTIQ+ respondents, they were more likely to have their homes flooded. They're more likely to be evacuated and displaced for 6 months. And after taking into account demographics as well as that flood impact, these population groups were more likely to report the mental health outcomes. Interestingly though, the LGBTIQ community, depression was not one of those. And that comes up a bit later in the presentation as well. All right, so turning to the resilience measures. I don't know if you remember the survey as such, but it was quite a lengthy survey, and there were 2 parts to it. The first part covered flood exposure, the experience basically, as well as the mental health outcomes. The second part covered the social capital measures. So the second part wasn't compulsory. We really encouraged people to do the full survey. And 1,900 of the 25,000 did, so that's about 75% of the respondents, which is fantastic. So according to social capital theory, social capital is made up of two connected components, which are causally connected as indicated by the arrow up there. So essentially, the more you participate within community, the greater your personal social cohesion. And that then leads to better health and well-being, including psychological health. As your social capital goes down, your mental health risk goes up. So the two components are referred to as what people do, that's the community participation, and what people feel, the social cohesion aspect. And it's what people do that really is the area which is more amenable to change. So we used validated measures within the survey to capture these components from the respondents. For community participation, one of the co-authors for this, Helen Berry, has developed up a community participation questionnaire, and that was done in New South Wales, southern New South Wales, a coastal community, the Eurobodalla Shire, if you know that. It's also a diverse socio-economic sort of region. So quite, I suppose, similar in that respect to the Northern Rivers area. So what's made up of that is informal social connection, and that refers to those activities that provide a social life but are more spontaneous and flexible. So it's chatting with the neighbours, spending time with friends or extended family, or being active on social media. And then there's civic engagement, which are more the organised aspects of life. So you might volunteer, you might participate in a sporting club or a community-based club, or you go to arts and culture and community events. So the personal social cohesion is made up of 4 components, and these are measures that were developed internationally, and they include a sense of belonging from the interpersonal support evaluation list. So that includes perceived availability of someone to turn to. If you're lonely or if you're going through a particular crisis, you can turn to somebody for help. It also refers to just being able, having somebody to turn to, that to hang out with, to go do stuff with. Social trust from the Organisational Trust Inventory and World Values Survey. That's about the perception of community, people in community telling the truth, keeping their word, and having a feeling that most people can be trusted. Reciprocity, you feel that most people in community try to be helpful as opposed to looking out for themselves. And optimism, expecting good things to happen. All right, so what this table presents is a summary statistics. So at that 6-month point after the flood, we've broken down the components according to the general respondent group, as well as the sub-population groups that we're particularly interested in. So the other respondent group doesn't include, I should say, people on income support, Indigenous people, or LGBTIQ community. So the subgroups are then compared to the other respondent group. And the asterisks indicate if there is a significant difference between those subgroups and the general population, the general respondent group. So we can see then from these scores, which range from a scale from 1 to 7. So the higher the score, the more you participate in community, the more you feel connected to community. For community participation, indicators, it's quite similar across each of the groups. There's no statistically significant difference anyway, although for the Indigenous population, it looks like there is a lower informal social connection, and that could be due also to the low numbers that we've got from Indigenous respondents. So we just lack the statistical power to show the difference there. For personal social cohesion measures, it's interesting that for each of the subgroups, they have less of a feeling or a lower feeling of belonging and optimism. And for people on income support and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, social trust and a lower levels of social trust and reciprocity. Okay, so just coming back to our framework, what we're interested in is determining how the social capital that we just looked at mediates the interaction between impact of flooding and mental health. And the way we do this is through hierarchical logistic regression, which is basically building models on a step-by-step basis, incorporating those factors. So socio-demographic factors, the flood impact, that's measured by a severity scale, so how many locations were damaged from a scale of 1 to 5. Then community participation and social cohesion variables. So as we build the model, we see how each of those influence or predict the likelihood of somebody reporting symptoms of each of those mental health outcomes. So firstly, post-traumatic stress. So what this table here shows is, again, those components I just spoke about for each of the different respondent groups. The circles indicate a significant association between that particular component and reporting PTS symptoms. So the green circles represent a protective factor, so being more engaged in community participation, at least for the general respondent group and people on income support, means that they are less likely to report PTS. The blue circles are your risk factors. So as we can see, the flood impact across all of the groups was a significant factor in predicting people reporting post-traumatic stress. So there's quite interesting differences between the subgroups. So the general respondent group, their protective factors as social capital theory would suggest. So greater community participation, also sense of belonging, optimism and social trust, they're all protective against PTS. For income support recipients, again, sense of belonging and optimism were protective. But interestingly, for an item that belongs to the sense of belonging scale, expressing a desire to spend more time socially with others, that if people were expressing that meant that there was a greater chance for them to report PTS symptoms. So that is a risk factor for income support recipients. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and LGBTIQ community, sense of belonging was a key factor as well. So it's interesting that the sense of belonging is really a significant factor right across the population groups. So then moving to anxiety, quite similar patterning, although for community participation, the civic engagement element comes in for the general respondent group. So if you're engaged more in those organised activities, you're less likely to report anxiety. Again, sense of belonging was key across most of the The respondent groups, just marginally though, for LGBTIQ. It was quite interesting actually. For anxiety, there wasn't, the social capital measures didn't really explain much, or didn't really predict much when it comes to reporting anxiety, probable anxiety. So there's obviously other factors contributing to the level of anxiety reported by the LGBTIQ community. And for the Indigenous community, we see that same indicator, wishing to spend more time socially with others, being a risk factor. And lastly, for depression, again, the patterning is quite similar. Although interestingly, flood impact wasn't a big issue for LGBTIQ community, and we saw that earlier when we looked at the association between mental health outcomes and the flood damage. Again, sense of belonging is key across the three subgroups. And interestingly, the reciprocity item. So having a feeling that community are out there to try and help others as opposed to looking after themselves was a key protective factor for LGBTIQ community. All right, it's a lot of information to take in. Sorry for that. I've tried to distill some of the key messages here. For me, similar levels, from that descriptive stats table, there's similar levels of community participation across groups, but there's less feeling of optimism and belonging for marginalised groups. In terms of the personal social cohesion and how that influences mental health outcomes, sense of belonging is key across most groups. However, there is subtle differences and important differences, I think, amongst respondent groups. Optimism and trust was important for that general respondent group, not so much for the marginalised groups. Wishing to increase their social connectedness came out for some of those marginalised subgroups, so income support recipients and Indigenous respondents. And sometimes social capital measures don't explain much. So we saw that with anxiety and depression for the LGBTIQ community. So I think, it doesn't provide all of the answers, obviously, and we do need to work with the relevant community groups to understand what this information means, what are the key factors, alternate key factors that go towards resilience and being protective against adverse mental health outcomes, and build on those strengths. So we also asked quite a few qualitative questions within the survey as well. One of them went towards post-traumatic growth. So it's really asking respondents out of the devastation, what, if anything, could you see as a positive outcome? There were, I think, 138 respondents out of the 2,500, so that's not many. It's 5%, 5 to 6% who answered that question. It could indicate that the respondent group found it difficult to label, to name, tell a story about the positive outcomes. It also could be that was the last question of the survey. That was quite lengthy, so that could be a factor as well. But just a quick analysis of those, that question, and it might point to as well other sort of resilience factors that the social capital measures haven't picked up. So there were 5 categories there, and people talked about positivity in their own lives or in their family lives. got an example quote here where somebody's doing a degree to further their education, and that's really as a fallback if a flood occurs again and they're out of work. The other category was around increased awareness of self-care and motivate to look after yourself. So for some that meant more massage, for others it meant going out, doing art, singing, dancing. You can tell who's the extrovert and who's the introvert. In the physical home, so it's things like, using it as an opportunity to clean the house, paint the house, declutter, lifting items off the floor, just being better prepared for future floods. In terms of community, place and environment, there was some feeling that community as a whole is much stronger from the experience. I think we saw that here in Lismore, people pulling together, helping each other out. And also belonging and participation. So this goes towards the social capital. So people felt motivation to volunteer. From that, friendships developed and they felt community networks have been strengthened. So that there's sort of keys as well from the qualitative data that we have in terms of looking at what might build resilience. So it's an important part and important addition to the quantitative data. Far more interesting, perhaps. So I have to sort of go through what the strengths and limitations of this analysis is. It's a cross-sectional design, so we can't, as I mentioned before, untangle cause and effect. We don't have the pre-mental health measures. It relates to the survey respondent group only. The 2,500 people weren't representative of the broader region. We saw that in the population stats, majority women. We also have a lack of validated measures for particular subgroups. So that, particularly with social capital, most of those measures that I spoke about were developed within a general population. So we don't have necessarily the information or the features that are important for a subpopulation like Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people, where cultural participation is important. Also, just levels of discrimination that occurs with Aboriginal people, LGBTIQ community, is likely to prevent community participation or the feelings of being part of a community. So we desperately need some validated measures for those groups. The strengths are that the findings align with social capital theory. We have new information related to social capital, particularly amongst the marginalised subgroups, which can then provide focus for future research. So where to from here? So we did do a 2-year follow-up survey, you may have seen. So that will be interesting. We will begin analysis on that soon, so that will give us an indication of what's changed in terms of mental health burden, as well as the social capital measures. We'll obviously continue our community collaboration. So that part of that is really talking to relevant groups, as I said, around these results and prioritising what we can do in terms of future research, particularly around interventions. I think that's the key. We need to start acting on some of this stuff. And that will, part of that, obviously, no one's got money, so we need to develop application for ongoing research. So thank you so much for listening and enduring the statistical side of things. I'd just like to say a big thank you to community advisory groups, the people who responded to the survey, survey politors, some of them are here, and as well as our funders. So thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
You've done a great job with the statistical analysis. You shouldn't be so apologetic about it. I think it's fantastic what you've, the analysis you've done. And, I think one of the really good things about that overall is that it confirms the social capital theory across for the general population, and including to a large extent for the subpopulations, and where it doesn't hold for some of the subpopulations that may be due to small numbers as well. We're not finding statistically significant findings. So I think it's really encouraging that it confirms this social capital theory, which really gives us some guidance about, well, what can be done to strengthen the factors that build social capital. So my question is, what do we know about the evidence of interventions that build social capital?
That's a very good question, Ross. I think interventions generally need to be specific to location. I'm sure there has been evaluations done of interventions. Like there's been studies, for instance, post the Victorian Black Saturday fires, which looked at a number of resilience activities that occurred after that, and it was all very positive. Things like setting up a community cafe, where volunteers worked, for instance. Perhaps some of that can be adapted to here, but I really do generally think that interventions need to be built from the community base, particularly when it comes to the subpopulations like we've just spoken about, and working with community to know what's best for those particular groups, as well as the general population. Yeah. No, I do agree. I mean, there's general things that can be adapted to different locations. And Helen Berry is working with state government around interventions to build adaptive capacity. So there's work being undertaken, and I think we can definitely learn from what comes out from that.
Thanks, Veronica. I've got a question about people with disabilities. I noticed they weren't an identified subgroup. So I was interested if you're able to pick up through the data any particular effects on those that identified as having a disability. Just as an anecdote, I asked because I assisted a gentleman with a physical disability who was initially heavily impacted because as the waters were rising, he was didn't have the capacity to actually remove any of his belongings because he was physically disabled. A lot of people had some time to try and salvage some items, get washing machines up a bit higher, etc. He didn't, and then because his lower level flat, which was built in under a house, was completely inundated, he lost everything. He was then homeless, and so didn't even receive the leaflet, the flyer put out by sort of advertising the grant made available, or there was a public fundraising campaign that people gave to, and then that was divided up amongst the respondents. But in fact, the person who lived in the higher part of the house, who was unaffected by the flood, was able to claim the money because they were in a street that was flood affected. But and it apparently was quite a thing that a number of people missed out in that respect. So I'm interested to know, for him it had obviously a devastating impact, but interested to know if the data was able to indicate for those with disabilities and whether there was any rationale behind not having people with disability nominated as a subgroup.
Just to that question, that no rationale really for not having people with disability as a subgroup. There is potential for us to examine the data though for people, given that we captured disability support payments, so that that's if they are receiving disability support. So there is definite potential for us to examine them as a subgroup, such as we've done here. Also through the qualitative data, I think I remember reading similar stories to what you've just described within the qualitative context. As with anything, it just comes down to resources and having the time and dedicated people working on the data, which is our biggest issue at the moment. But we'd be keen to look at people with disability and how the flood and all of the other factors that we've just discussed, how that impacted on them.
By any means see those as the only vulnerable groups. We were also, young children are obviously another very important group, but because of the nature of the survey, we couldn't do research with or on young children. People who are homeless or people who were displaced from their homes and had to move away. Another group very difficult to reach with this type of research. So we absolutely recognise that they're a very important group, but we need a different sort of research method to reach them. So it comes down to, I think the point that Veronica was making was that we kind of can't do everything with in one project with one standard method. We have to use different methods to reach different groups. But as Veronica said, we could certainly do an analysis using disability support payments as a proxy way of identifying people on disability. The extent to which we, that analysis may be useful would be dependent on the numbers of people who are in that and whether that gives us enough statistical power. But it's a very interesting question, because clearly they are an important group that we need to know about and which would require potentially particular strategies to reach them and support them in the event of a disaster, or thinking about preparation or preparedness for the future.
I was just going to say, throw it out there, maybe if people wanted to share, people who are here wanted to share examples of things in their community that they think could contribute to some of the resilience outcomes. Unless there are other questions, I just thought that might be a good thing to do.
So I mean interpretation, Maddie, of the findings. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea, but that's not what I'm going to do. We can do that after I ask my question. I just had a real nuts and bolts statistics question that my brain is stuck on. You showed a slide that had numerical values for the different aspects of resilience that had the numbers. Yeah, this one. So is it just my high school maths brain that thinks that those are scores out of 10? And
1 to 7.
1 to 7.
Yeah.
Okay, so based on that, we can sort of, and those are all 6 months post-flood measurements of the sort of their social capital levels of resilience.
Yeah, so they're mean scores. So under each of those components, there were several questions that pointed to those components.
Yep.
So it's basically the scale that was presented in the survey was a Likert scale from 1 to 7.
Oh, yep.
So it's basically an addition of all of the questions and getting an average of those for each of these respondent groups. So that's what's displayed there, the mean scores as well as the standard deviation.
Great, thanks. I just was really interested in it as a snapshot of how socially engaged people are at that 6 months afterwards point. Thanks. I don't suppose, is there any studies we can look at that are comparative so that you understand what, I guess it's hard to look at our community, but so that we could do like a before and after comparison?
Yeah, I'll have to check with the author of, well, anyway, Helen, who developed up the community participation questionnaire that we used. I actually have seen a paper where she used similar measures. That was the Eurobodalla Shire, so it's South Coast, New South Wales. Informal social connection was a lot lower, so between 2 and 3. So it would indicate then the Northern Rivers is doing pretty well for connectedness.
Just on that, I'm just wondering if there are any national surveys that maybe don't necessarily use that scale, but use other mechanisms for measuring things like this, and whether we could see if the Northern Rivers is generally different.
Yeah, that's a good question, Meg.
I'm just learning to read this too. For the LGBTQ community, I'm not sure if intersex status was asked, was it?
No.
Okay.
Was it?
There was an intersex question?
Oh, was it in the first
Okay,
survey?
okay. Okay, got it.
Oh,
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
That's okay. So for the LGBTQ communities, from reading it, so it shows like informal social connections higher than the general population.
Yeah.
Civic engagement is pretty much the same. Belonging is lower, and optimism is lower, and social trust is pretty much the same, and reciprocity. Yeah. But we are seeing the disproportionate mental health impacts. So I think when I'm thinking about informal social connection, civic engagement, community participation, there is sometimes multiple communities that you can participate in. And as lots of people in the room would be very aware of this, like you could feel very connected with your own community and accepted, but then in the general population, you feel that is not there. So I guess like there is like multiple layers happening around community participation. So when we are looking at solutions or in terms of resilience building activities, I think about like broader community engagement and how broader communities embrace diversity and lots of people who may be marginalized in certain settings. So it's very hard to have, it's a little bit more of a, who is Lismore? How do we see ourselves and how do we really embrace subpopulations? So people feel they have place in lots of different spaces they engage in.
Thanks, Anna.
Just a comment on that. I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding of social capital is that it's partly about encouraging people to engage in groups that they feel like they've got a connection, so basically getting engaged in any social activities, and people will tend to gravitate to those things that they're interested in, which probably means they've got something in common with others. But the other aspect of that, I think, is that one of the good things about that kind of engaging with with community groups, it is to some extent people are actually engaging across boundaries, whether they're professional boundaries or workplace boundaries or other kind of social group boundaries. And it's those social activities that build those connections between some of the boundaries that exist in communities that actually helps to build a social capital. But there may be other people who are more expert in this. But I think going to your point, I think we need to be working on doing both. So encouraging and supporting people to be with others who they kind of identify with and strengthen those connections, but also trying to encourage people to engage across the boundaries and generally building a more inclusive community. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in the context of a flood, I think it's about having connections, neighbourhood connections, because you might be the only gay in the village, but it might be that you've got your own community that you're connected with, but when it comes to your physical community, you do feel isolated. So I think that it's probably because of the nature of this, was your suburb flooded, was your neighbourhood flooded? I think that's worth thinking about.
Point.
Thanks. It's just occurring to me as we're talking that this particular survey, we're talking about resilience in terms of a social capital perspective, but quite often when you talk about resilience in disaster contexts, they're actually talking about preparedness. So, and I was just sort of trying to recall the content of the survey, and because this was a mental health survey, we didn't necessarily, were there questions about preparedness or previous flood experience? I just think it would be interesting to compare those concepts of resilience, you know, because in the disaster sector, and if you're talking to SES and people like that, then resilience is all about having your flood plan in place, being prepared, knowing where you go, where you evacuate. But quite often, and in this context, resilience is around social connection, which is, I would argue, just as important. So just any comment on that?
Sorry, Megan, were you going to say?
Is that how we're defining resilience? I thought we were looking at what's predicting resilience, with the outcomes being whether or not you have an adverse mental health outcome or a non-adverse, or you don't have an adverse mental health outcome. And so therefore, your resilience is about what are the factors that contribute to you having a better outcome, I think. Is that
the ability to really bounce back from a disaster individually? So that's having those support networks around you that really enables that bounce back.
But the outcome of resilience, there may be. But how we're defining resilience is not whether or not you have social capital or social connections. That's not the resilience. That's what builds your resilience. The resilience, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but I think it's conceptually we're looking at whether you have an adverse mental health outcome. If you don't, you're more resilient. Yep.
It depends on the impact.
I don't know. I think.
Resilience is a tricky.
Yes, it's yeah. Yeah, go on.
We did ask a question about previous flood experience. We haven't had the chance to analyse that yet. And also just from looking at the qualitative data, a lot of stuff did come up around preparedness from the respondents, just voluntarily based on the free text questions that were asked in the survey. But yeah, just haven't had a chance to draw that stuff out yet.
Thanks, Veronica, for presenting that summary overview. I'm just wondering, how do you see the results of this work being matched up and combined with other data, other information from multiple sources to then prepare for the next flood or prepare for the next severe weather event to reduce harm to the population and to have, for events like these, to have less impact on the community that's been impacted.
Thanks, Rick. I see really the community advisory groups as being key to us moving ahead with, you know, figuring out how best to use the data from this survey. We also do have the second 2-year survey, which will go towards informing a bit more of the long-term sort of trajectory in relation to mental health, as well as how social, you know, community participation may have changed, or social cohesion may have changed. So I think it's all quite valuable information to work with others to bring in their knowledge to then, you know, sort of plan appropriate strategies for mitigating that future risk. So we'll be knocking on your door as well in relation to the farmer cohort, which we need to do similar analysis for. Yeah, so it's really having those community partnerships that's going to make it the transfer of knowledge easier for community and building a more resilient community. Shouldn't use that word, resilient.
I just wanted to, if I could, not to take anything away from the research itself, but just to acknowledge both Ellie and Maddie in the room here. As two of the many people who rolled their sleeves up and got right into the thick of it in initiating the Helping Hands community response. And they've been acknowledged in other ways, but I thought it's worthwhile acknowledging them. And I'm sure that both of them, obviously Maddie's been involved in the research project, which would have been kind of a fascinating sort of flow on. And Ellie's probably done 1,000 hours behind the scenes with council more to around all of this as well. And partly to respond to a query that Maddie put up a little earlier, in terms of maybe identifying things for future that could assist with social cohesion and I guess building resilience as a whole. Again, just highlighting the scenario that I highlighted before, the gentleman that was disabled and then was rendered homeless. I guess a coordinated way of information gathering perhaps between FACS housing, homelessness service providers, to really try to identify that cohort as being a high priority group of people to follow up with. This person, I assisted him to complete this survey, but he was very much on the fringe of social inclusion, if you like, all the way along. He started out that way. The events of the flood certainly pushed him further to the fringe. And were it not for me just having to work in the community sector and sort of knowing about these things that were going on, I think he would have been left on the fringe and largely forgotten. And it surprised me that there was no, and I was surprised that FACS Housing actually hadn't. They obviously assisted people with, the standard sort of 2 nights of emergency accommodation, those who'd presented at the Flood Recovery Centre. But after that, there wasn't much follow on. There was no coordinated communication with, there was a little bit with, Connecting Home, which is one of the major homelessness service providers, but largely he was forgotten. And so he actually did miss out on the community, I can't remember if it had a name, but the actual community fundraising campaign that was then divided up amongst recipients. Everyone got roughly, I think, $1,200 or $1,400, but he missed out entirely because he didn't get his form in on time, like it was a day late. And we went up and spoke with the Mayor, Isaac Smith, and Annie McWilliam at Council to try and sort of see if there was a way around it. But so I guess his story, I think, highlights it struck me that there must have been more people like him that were actually left out. And despite all the incredible efforts of like Helping Hands and all the service responses and all the amazing council response, and they did an incredible job, there were still these forgotten people that are kind of left out on the fringes.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Thank you. And it's similar stories happening in the Tweed as well. Just talking to the community advisory group up there, with people having to live in their cars basically, and also missing out on those sort of supports as a result. So facts is a key part of our community advisory group. So yeah, we'll do our best to draw attention to that, to the more isolated of our community.
Hi, Veronica.
Oh, hey.
Over here.
Hey, Michael.
Well, as Ellie was saying, resilience can be interpreted many different ways. Now, prior to the impact of the flood, I'm sure a lot of people thought they were resilient and then realised that after the event they actually did have to reach out for help. I'm hoping that kind of removed the stigma from, putting your hand up saying, hey, I'm not coping. Do you know if that has remained where people are more willing now to actually put their hand up for help when, with the ongoing effects of the flood, or has it subsided again where the stigma is starting to come back in?
I guess probably the second survey might give some insight into that, because we actually specifically included questions around service support.
Well, put that question on hold. I'll ask it after the next survey then.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. I'm looking at the time, so we do need to wrap up, but I just wanted to pick up on the question that Rick asked before about how we're using the findings from the survey so far. So we have been feeding it back to the community in general and to particular organisations that we think can make use of that and use it to inform their own planning and development. So we've actually been through the community advisory group actually feeding that back. So to some extent, we're looking to them because they kind of understand their business best to think about, well, what is this information used for you? But we've also been doing other things, like, for example, we wrote a submission to the Banking Royal Commission, thanks Joe and John in particular, because we had a lot of really interesting findings there about insurance and challenges with a major people following the difficulties that people had around insurance. So we have made that submission to, into the things like the Banking Royal Commission, which provide opportunity to really our research findings into high levels of government where that, things make difference. And we also wrote a submission, thanks again to Joe and John and Maddie, to there was a planning application in Murwillumbah in terms of developing some low-cost housing, and because of the information we've been able to generate from the study about the impacts on mental health of people having not just their yards, but their homes, but their yards flooded, has significant impact. So we were able to provide a lot of the evidence from our research to say these are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about in assessing this development application, because you need to be making sure that people are not only not having their homes flooded, but also not having their yards flooded and their roads and sewage systems disrupted. So those are the sorts of things that we have been busy with. I think this is really where Maddie's question was coming from, is in terms of this resilience data, and this is thinking about resilience in a different way, Ellie, to the way that the emergency folk think about resilience, is we are really keen to work with community advisory groups and others about on these findings. So what does this show? And that goes back to the point that I was making immediately after Veronica's presentation is that the findings do confirm that social capital theory. So there has been a lot written about what works in terms of social capital and how that can protect people's sense of resilience. And so we need to learn from that, but think about how can we apply those lessons in this environment. So Maddie's question to you all was, what do you think is important and what will work, and what can we do through our own agency with our own communities to kind of think about how do we build that sort of social capital which will protect our communities against these types of natural disasters in the future. So hopefully that helps to answer your question.
Just in the realm of what can we do to build community resilience, just a quick plug. Helping Hands were funded by Foundation for Rural, Regional and, what is it? Regional Rural Resilience, FRRR. We're doing a community event probably on September the 8th, and we're sort of trying to find the sweet spot between community development and preparedness information as a way of building resilience in our communities. So just keep your eye out for that. September the 8th, we think it's going to be. Community event down by the river. We've clashed with you before. Anyway, we'll, to be confirmed.
Great. If everyone could join me to thank Veronica for that presentation and the broader team. And if you could just make sure you've got your name down on the attendance list, that would be really helpful. Thanks, everyone.